Hello, my name's Jackie and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm an aspiring fiction writer, and if you are also a writer, you know that one of the most valuable things writers can do to improve their skills is to read frequently and widely. The problem is, I've been in a bit of a reading slump for the last couple of months, and the same thing happened last year. You see, I tend to have a fairly good start to the year because my family goes to my Goodreads TBR list and just selects a bunch of things from there, and that's my Christmas present. So I always have a good January, maybe February, because I have all of these awesome books that they've bought me. And then I get through the list of Christmas books and I'm not sure where to go next. And I think part of it is there are over 100 things on my TBR, so it's a bit hard to know where to start. And sometimes I pick things and they're just not as good as the things I read after Christmas, which all tend to be around 4 or 5 stars. So I get a little bit disheartened and lose my enthusiasm for the new reading year. The other thing that happened this year is that I signed up for Kindle Unlimited for the first time, and this might be a little bit of a controversial opinion, but I think that Kindle Unlimited has caused me to read a number of much lower quality books. And that's not to say that all books available through Kindle Unlimited are of a lower quality, or that self-published books are of a lower quality, because I do think there is a larger portion of self-published books available through Kindle Unlimited as authors who don't have traditional representation or traditional marketing budgets are trying to reach a wider audience. Having said that, in general, even though there are high-quality self-published books, there are also very low-quality self-published books because there are no gatekeepers. Anyone can convert any Word document into a Kindle ebook. So I feel like a lot of the things that are getting suggested to me now are just of a much lower caliber. I'm getting a little bit sick of them. They're making me not want to read as much. And I can't think of, off the top of my head, I think March, April and May, most of the things I've read have been, 2 or 3 stars. So it's really dampening my enthusiasm to keep reading, especially when there are other things like Netflix and YouTube that require far less input from me in order for my brain to be entertained. So I've decided to try a new service called TBR, or Tailored Book Recommendations, where a professional book recommender recommends 3 books for you to read based on your preferences, your reading history, and so on. So I thought this would be an interesting video to see, 1, what the process is like, 2, what the recommendations are like, and if the recommendations seem to be in alignment with the information I've put in my profile and my preferences, and then 3, when I read the books, whether they are books that really resonate with me, whether they are 4 or 5 star ones that reignite my enthusiasm for reading this year, and all in all, what I think of the service. So, step 1 is to get registered. So I'm on my laptop and I have the website mytbr.co open in front of me. Now let's see how this works. In a book lover's life, there is nothing as magical as a perfect, surprising recommendation from someone who just gets you. But finding those people can be tough. That's where TBR comes in. So far promising. So you start by telling them about your reading habits and what you're looking for. They select 3 books just for you, and they send you those recommendations. So let's get started. Favorite genres are a bit challenging because many of my favorite books, I'm not 100% sure which genre they're actually in. The books that I really love, the ones that are 5 stars, they tend to sit a bit outside of genres for me, or at least I can't categorize them, so I'm giving this my best shot. I'm not looking to explore anything new with these recommendations. I'm just looking to find more of what I love, and then once I feel like, yes, I love reading again, I have a good track record, I've got a good list of things in my pipeline, then I think I'll get a bit more adventurous. So the last few books I really loved is a bit hard because I can think off the top of my head of some of my favorite books, obviously, but many of them weren't that recent. In fact, I think I last had my longest streak of really great books before we came to Estonia, so I'm going to say the end of 2017. So it's been I have read good books since then, obviously, but then I had sort of 2-3 months where everything was amazing. So I need to look at what I've read recently to see what I'm going to add to this list.
5 minutes later.
Many of these are actually from my Christmas list, so I'm not sure if that's recent enough, but if it's this year, I'm counting it. I've also got a couple of books that I reread this year, like The Girl with All the Gifts and You, which I think is a sign that I did struggle to find things I really like because I'm going back to older favourites. So even though I didn't discover them recently, I'm still including them in my recent favourites list. I want the recommendations to be familiar because, again, I'm just looking for more of what I love, and if this works out well, I might be more adventurous next time. I'm not looking for recommendations on a certain theme. The other thing to keep in mind is that this is a quarterly subscription you sign up for, so obviously if I don't like it first time around, I'll just cancel the subscription. Then if I like the first round of recommendations, I'll probably start being more adventurous next quarter once they've proven themselves to me, once I know that they can reliably select books that I actually enjoy. So you have the choice between receiving books and just receiving the recommendations. Now, because I'm not in the US, I can't ask to receive the books. I don't think I'd want to do that option anyway, just in case I've got a recommendation that I didn't like. Whereas if you just get the recommendations, then you can look at the recommendations and then decide whether you want to go ahead with buying and reading these books or not. I've joined! So now that I've joined and filled out that initial questionnaire, I can also complete my dashboard, which includes more information. So let's do that now. So the first question in my dashboard is, what are my all-time favourite books? And this is good because if you use Goodreads like I do, I can just go through my Goodreads profile, filter my read books to anything that I rated 5 stars, and it makes it really easy to pick out which ones I liked the best. The next one is any books I absolutely hated, and that's hard to answer because most of the books I absolutely hated were just not good, as in they were self-published and clearly needed editing, and I doubt that's going to be in the selection that these people have available, so I don't know if it's relevant to share them. Then there are a lot of non-fiction books I really hated, and the reason for that is, as I've mentioned in the past, I have been a non-fiction editor and a non-fiction ghostwriter. I do have quite particular ideas about how a practical how-to book should be structured and organised, and when books significantly deviate from that structure, I tend to get very frustrated because I'm impatient and I don't like people rambling, but I'm not looking for non-fiction book recommendations, so I don't think that's relevant here either. The next one is favourite TV shows and movies, and I now wish I had a Goodreads for TV shows and movies because obviously I know I have these, but I can't think of all of them off the top of my head, so I'm going to do a list of what I can remember and then maybe build on it later because you can continue to update this dashboard in the future. There's types of content you want your bibliologist to warn you about, so trigger warnings. I don't think I have any. I'm open to most types of content. I suppose if they recommend something and I am triggered by it, I will find out, but I'm not too worried at the moment. Anything else you want us to know? No, I'm actually not sure what else I could cover that they haven't asked about. So I think that's it. So I've completed the initial questionnaire, I've completed my profile and my dashboard, and now I need to wait 10 days until I get my email with my recommendations. Last night I got my email from Tailored Book Recommendations, so I'm going to open it now and see what they recommended to me. Ready the confetti, Kellen, embrace your bookshelves. Your TBR selections are ready. View recommendations. My TBR is here. Your bibliologist has searched the shelves and selected 3 awesome new additions to your TBR. Open your letter and get ready to get reading. This is a lot of clicks. Welcome to TBR, we're so happy to have you here. As your bibliologist, I've pored over your Goodreads profile and the info you provided on what you're looking for. Now I'm hoping these 3 picks scratch your particular reading itch. The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. This intense mystery skirts the thriller line, and it's made all the more intriguing with its unusual fantasy twist. Aidan is stuck in a loop, reliving the death of Evelyn Hardcastle until he solves her murder, but every day he wakes up in a different body, with no knowledge of what came before. So this is interesting, and I think I can see why they suggested it, because I said one of my recent reads that I really enjoyed was Recursion by Blake Crouch, and that's a similar thing, not waking up in different bodies, but basically experiencing different timelines. Similarly, I also liked Dark Matter by Blake Crouch, which is experimenting with parallel universes. I liked All Our Wrong Todays, which is and other timeline things. So history gets changed in the 60s, and that means 2016, when the book is set, completely changes for the main character, but he remembers the original timeline. I also really enjoyed, I think it's Every Day. I'll put the cover on the screen in case I've got the name wrong, which is about a character who doesn't actually have a body. So every day he or she wakes up in a different person's body. So I can see why they've recommended this, and it sounds really intriguing. So optimistic so far. Now, recommendation 2, Gods of Jade and Shadow. This fast-paced fantasy feels both modern and classic in the way it melds the Jazz Age setting with Mexican folklore. Given your love of Madeline Miller's Greek retellings, yes, I really liked Circe and the Song of Achilles. Both of them were in my all-time favourites. The quest of Cassiopeia Tun to the depths of the Mayan underworld seems like a good fit. Okay, so 2 out of 3, looking pretty good. And the last one is Dare Me, a twisty contemporary YA in the vein of The Truth About Keeping Secrets, which is a book I read at the very beginning of this year, or the very end of last year. It was one of my Christmas presents, so around that time. Abbott's novel is tense and dark and provocative. Addie and Beth have always been best friends. A new cheer coach. Oh dear, I'm not really a cheerleading person, but we'll see. Addie and Beth have always been best friends. A new cheer coach unsettles the group dynamics, and a mystery death and investigation makes everything even murkier. I'm not sure about the cheerleading angle. What I want to do is take a quick look at each of these books on Goodreads and just see what their average ratings are. So I've opened each of these on Goodreads, and the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle and Gods of Jade and Shadow both have a 3.9 rating, which is pretty good, and most of the books I tend to like do tend to have a rating in the high 3s or low 4s. Dare Me, which is the one I was a little worried about, only has 3.22, so I'm still going to read it to see what it's like, but that's interesting. Now, obviously, Goodreads ratings are subjective. There are books with fairly high average ratings that I have not liked at all. And a lot of that has to do with who the target market is and whether the appropriate audience is reading the book, to be completely frank. Because there are certain things, like what a 16-year-old girl thinks is a 5-star book is probably different to what a 48-year-old man thinks is a 5-star book. So even though an erotic romance might have a rating of 4 and then a classic might have a rating of 4, I wouldn't consider them to be in the same ballpark, even though their respective audiences both feel they are good books. So taking these ratings with a grain of salt, but it's just interesting that 2 of them were like 3.9 and one's 3.22, which is a fairly big difference on a scale of 5. So from here, I'm going to order each of these books, and I'll let you know how I go when I start reading them. I finished the first of my TBR recommendations, which was the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, and this book frustrated me greatly just because I enjoyed parts of it so much. There were parts where I thought, yes, this is what I've been looking for, this is a 5-star read, and then there were parts that just lost me. The main character is Aidan Bishop, who has been given the task of solving the murder of Evelyn Hardcastle. He has amnesia when we first meet him, so has no idea who he is or what's going on, so this information is given to him by other characters. The setup is he will relive the same day 8 times through 8 different hosts, all of whom have some connection to Evelyn and can gather some information about her murder. If he solves the mystery, he is free to go. If not, he will go back to square one with his memory erased again and needs to start the process again. So, for the mystery element, so solving the murder of Evelyn, the waking up in a different body each day, piecing together the facts and the clues from different perspectives, that I loved. I thought that was very well done, especially when we get to later parts of the book where he's on host 5, 6, 7, and 8, and he starts realizing that he needs to plant clues for the earlier hosts to find to keep the day unfolding as it's supposed to. So seeing how the different host storylines intertwined and the cyclicalness of the whole process, that was really interesting. I thought it was really well done. And there are certain moments when I thought it was definitely going to be a 4-star, potentially a 5-star, because I loved that part of the book. What I didn't like was the explanation behind it. Both the hinting towards the fact that there was an explanation earlier in the book and once we got the final explanation later in the book. So we have Aidan in his host trying to solve this mystery, and he has sort of a handler type character who's dressed up as a plague doctor, so in one of those masks with the beak. And that always felt off to me. It seems strange that in this world where there was no sign of magic or any sort of supernatural activity, there was this figure who seemed, if not supernatural, to have some sort of supernatural means for keeping Aiden here and assigning him this task and being able to put him in this endless loop. And every time we encountered him, like, that was when I sort of got sick of the book. I was really enjoying the mystery, and then that felt like an interruption to the main plot, and that brought my enjoyment down. So I was having this 4-star read, and then it would drop to 3 stars whenever this guy showed up. Similarly, there is a villain who is sort of portrayed as the major antagonist throughout the book, but I didn't feel like he had enough to do with the main plot. He's known as the Footman, and he basically shows up trying to kill Aiden's various hosts throughout the book. However, he wasn't, other than an added pressure beyond the fact that there was this 8-day deadline, he didn't really seem to have anything to do with the main plot. And again, whenever he showed up, like, I just got bored. Rather than heightening the stakes for me, it actually felt like I was being dragged out of the main story to deal with this distraction. So those were parts of the explanation for why everyone's here storyline, which I didn't think worked very well. Spoiler alert. Ultimately, they were in like a prison/purgatory type scenario where solving the mystery was almost like penance, where they needed to prove they'd changed and grown enough to figure it out, which would buy their freedom. I just thought it didn't work. Maybe it could have worked if we knew more about Aiden and the other characters who were trying to solve the mystery before they ended up in this loop of Evelyn Hardcastle's life and death. But we didn't, so when it was revealed, it was like, well, you know, I don't know or care who any of these people are, so I don't really care that they're getting set free. Ultimately, I think the author still could have had the whole Evelyn Hardcastle looping mystery, but if it hadn't been explained at all, I think it would have been a much more satisfying read. Like, if it hadn't been explained at all, and at the end they solve it and then they're free, and it's just the possibility of what's lying in front of them, I think that could have worked well. I think if it had have been some sort of game where, let's say, a bunch of wealthy people are using these people as like chess pieces almost, and popping them into a situation and seeing how they react and erasing their memories at the end of each loop, I think that could have worked well. Even though it's been overdone, I think some sort of computer simulation could have worked well. So let's say it's like a Black Mirror type of thing and everyone's plugged into this simulation where, sort of like a game as well, they're plugged into this simulation which takes them back to early 1900s where they're in this manor house having to solve this mystery, and once they solve it they're able to get free of the simulation. I think all of those would have made much more sense than what we got. So because of that, I was quite frustrated because I felt like this could have been a much better book and it wasn't, and unlike it just being one that was meh throughout, it had these moments that I really loved, and the fact that it couldn't keep it up was what frustrated me, and it's why I can't seem to let this go. So, how do I rate the service so far? Well, in terms of the recommendations, I still think this was a very good recommendation for me based on the things I've read in the past that I've liked. It had a lot of the similar mind-bendy puzzle elements that things like recursion, dark matter, and All Our Wrong Todays have. And the reason that I liked that part of the book so much was because it was a good match for me. Unfortunately, the book had elements that I didn't like as well. So because of that, I've given it a 3-star rating on Goodreads. I am a little bit less enthused about the next couple of books, mainly because if someone can recommend something that is actually a perfect fit for what I like and what I'm looking for, and I still don't love it, is there any hope? But we'll see with the next couple of books. I've now finished the second of my TBR recommendations, which was Dare Me by Meg Abbott. Dare Me is a book about a group of cheerleaders. The main character is Addie, short for Adelaide, and she is like the second in command to Beth, who is the captain and supreme mega bitch who everyone idolizes but is also scared of. Now, their world order gets turned upside down when a new coach comes into the picture. So the new coach starts in chapter 1, and she is 27, so 10 years older than the girls, and she's still they describe her as being fit and tight and focused, and she's a former cheerleader but clearly still embodies that. And In the past, the cheerleaders have sort of had the run of the show. They can manipulate anyone. The old coach basically seemed to let them do whatever they wanted, and Beth, the captain, was running the show. The new coach is not having any of that, and she really whips them into shape. And most of the girls love it, and they start idolizing her. Now, Beth is not a fan of this because she's lost her position as Queen Bee, so throughout the entire book you know that she's going to do something. She really wants to sabotage the coach somehow. And the book is essentially watching the dynamic between these different women, so Addie trying to keep Beth happy and under control while also trying to become closer to the coach who she idolizes, and Beth trying to think of a way to drag everything down so she can be in charge again. Now, this was not a good recommendation for me, I don't think. Even though the reason they recommended it was because of one of the recent books I liked. So they mentioned that if I liked The Truth About Keeping Secrets, I'd probably like this. And I can see why, because The Truth About Keeping Secrets, it is a YA book about teenage girls. There are some secrets. And this is also a YA book about teenage girls, and there are many secrets and many lies. The big difference, though, is that The Truth About Keeping Secrets is about grief and love. It's a much smaller story, it's much more personal, it's really about developing relationships, whereas this book was interesting. So it's also about relationships to a certain extent, but a lot of it felt very surface level to me, and I think part of that was the tone in which it was written, because the tone of the entire book was very harsh and intense and almost angry. Like driven to the point of angry, I think is a good way of describing it. And I understand that the main character is supposed to be an athlete. She's, especially once the new coach starts, she sees cheer as a sport. She gives everything. She doesn't eat properly. She's aware of her power when it comes to getting what she wants from teachers and boys and so on. And there are a couple of issues with this. One is that it's not clear where all of this anger comes from, because there doesn't seem to be any reason for her to seem so angry all the time. So that's one thing. The second thing is that it feels like, because the entire book is like, it's all written up here, it's all very intense, and that means there's nowhere to really go. So it feels like it's constantly building up, but because it's already so intense, there's nothing to build to. Now, admittedly, there is one moment in the climax which is the big game and the cheer routine and the big game, and I was like holding my breath because I'm like, what's she gonna do? So there was that moment, but other than that, even though like there is one particularly big event that happens in the book, aside from that, I didn't really feel anything because the tone or the style in which it was written was always so one note. I think the other thing that stopped this book from really resonating with me is that it's very hard to get a sense for who the main character is and what she wants and what she'll do to get it. Because there's that steady tone throughout the entire thing, you never really get a sense of yearning because it's always this like just anger. Then she's also very reactive, which isn't necessarily a problem, but on one hand she occasionally makes these comments about like how much she wants to be close to coach, how much she wants to be top girl, which happen in passing, but then she doesn't really take action in that direction. And at the very end, you could argue that she gets everything she wants, but it doesn't feel like a victory because there hasn't really been any build-up or work towards that. It's just she was sitting on the sidelines, all of this stuff happened, and she just happened to be one of the people standing at the end, so she got it by default. So all of those meant it wasn't a bad book, it just didn't really click with me. So all in all, I would rate that 2.5 stars. On Goodreads, I've rounded that down to 2 simply because the last one, the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, I think was more 3.5 for me, and I gave it 3, and I can't give this book the same rating as that one because even though that one frustrated me, the parts I enjoyed way more than the entire experience of reading this book. When it comes to TBR as an effective recommendation tool, I think they really missed the mark on this one. And I think something that would actually make the service better is if you can explain why you liked the books you've written down. So they asked for recent favourites. I wrote that The Truth About Keeping Secrets was a recent favourite from earlier this year. but it wasn't for the reasons that they assumed. Like, I think I don't really know, they're such different books. That's the thing, like the things that they have in common are very surface level, but when the experience of reading these books, the journeys the characters go on, the motivations are completely different. So there's a very loose connection between them. I don't think it's a safe bet to assume that anyone who likes one would like the other. However, something that would make that easier is if there was like a field saying book you liked and then why you liked it. And then they can go, okay, she didn't like this because it was a YA book about girls in high school and there are secrets. She liked it because it explored the grief of losing a father. It explored, trying to build relationships and trust again even when there are secrets involved. And I think if they knew that, and that was why I enjoyed the book, they would never have recommended this one to me. So that's 2 out of 3 books. At this stage I'm saying 1 thumbs up, 1 thumbs down. We'll see how the third one goes. I have now finished the third of my TBR book recommendations, which was Gods of Jade and Shadow. And I actually enjoyed this one the least of the 3 books that were recommended to me. So this book is about a girl called Cassiopeia who is basically treated like a slave in her grandfather's home, or a servant, so very Cinderella setup. One day she is told to stay home as a punishment while everyone goes to church, and she gets so angry that she decides she's going to open this secret chest in her grandfather's room in the hope that there's gold or treasure in there and she can use it to run away. She opens it, and inside she sees discarded bones, which as soon as she opens it, one of them embeds itself in her hand, and the others assemble into a skeleton which then grows skin, and turns out it's a god. And the plot of this book is this god was killed essentially and locked up by his brother, who is now ruling the underworld, and in order for him to regain his status he needs to find the missing parts of himself because he is missing an eye, a finger and a necklace. And she needs to help him because the bone that's in her hand is going to be sucking from her life force until she eventually dies. So time is of the essence. When it comes to the story, in theory this is something I should have liked. It has an interesting premise, it has fantasy elements which I like, it's based in Mexico in the 1920s, which just sounds interesting. The problem was that the author's writing style really got on my nerves. And I think there are a couple of issues I had with it. One is that the tone felt very middle grade to me. And that's not to say that I don't like middle grade books, I do read them on occasion, but this felt like it was skewed very young. Like of the 8 to 12 age range, this felt like something I would have read around 8 or 10. It felt like something that if I'd gone to the library one class, the librarian would have been reading this out loud. And the reason for this, it's very much telling rather than showing. So if a character's feeling something, the text says they felt angry, they felt sad, they felt worried, rather than showing us how they felt through the sensations they were actually feeling and the actions they took. So that was quite frustrating. And that actually led me to think that I was reading about a girl who was maybe 10 or 12 years old, and it wasn't until later in the book when context and developments in the plot made me think, okay, she's a bit older, like maybe 16, and I think it was around the 80% mark when it mentioned that she was 18 years old, which it didn't feel like that the entire time. And one of the antagonists in the book is her cousin, who we know is a couple of years older, and just his mentality and the way he expresses himself and the way he seems to think, he also felt like he was quite young, like I would have said, 12, maybe a very young 14. I had trouble finding information on whether this was supposed to be a YA or adult book, but it definitely was marketed towards an older audience, but it felt like it was written for a very young audience. And I felt like it was a real slog to get through just because of that style. I felt like I was being talked down to. I felt like things were moving very slowly. The writing was very tiresome, to the point that the plot didn't really matter. On top of that, for me at least, I found this writing style really sucked any life or spark from the story. So there were moments that should have been tense or should have been exciting or should have been raising emotions where I was just like trying to get through it so I could get to the end of the book and finish this video and give my feedback to the TBR service. And part of this was due to the tell rather than show way in which this had been written. So one example from quite early in the book, When her family left the next morning, Cassiopeia went to her grandfather's room and sat on the edge of the bed. He'd piled his shirts on a chair. Cassiopeia had brought along her sewing kit, but upon the sight of the stupid shirts, she tossed the sewing kit against the mirror atop the vanity. She would not ordinarily have allowed herself such a visible demonstration of her rage, but this time her anger was too overwhelming and she thought she'd catch on fire. I don't know about you, but I don't feel any anger or rage when I read that. So the writing style made what could have been a really exciting and engaging story really boring. There were also times when there was a moment when there could have been heightened emotions or heightened suspense or tension where the author completely interrupted that with some observation of the scenery or philosophical musing. So there's one moment when Cassiopeia thinks the god is going to kiss her, and this is how it goes. His thumb stroked over her knuckle and Hunkame leaned down in what she took to be a motion to kiss her. He had been afraid and uncertain, and now he was composed, and it was she who felt a shiver go down her spine. She remembered a story she'd read or heard, she could not much remember where, about men who took advantage of women on trains, using the privacy of the compartment as a means for mischief. It might have been a priest who issued the warning during a sermon. It was the kind of thing he might lecture them about. Ride a train and you'll find yourself with a bold, strange man. Kiss a man and soon enough he'll take liberties with you. Wait a little and you'll be carrying a baby bastard to be baptized at the church, with a single surname to his name. Yes, men could be brazen on a train. And so could women, she mused. She was, after all, here with him, chasing adventure, a fancy, chasing something. So we have this little aside and then we get back to the moment. There was a tightness in her throat. The sun shone harshly through the window, making his dark eye even darker, as if he objected to its light and conjured more shadows. Since she'd cast away 7 layers of decency already, she decided one more would not matter, and if he attempted a kiss, she'd allow it. So, this is a moment like that will he or won't he, that lean in, almost kiss. Like, I love almost kiss moments, and that's something that there should be, you're holding your breath as you read it to find out what will happen. And in this book, I wasn't holding my breath for any of these moments because they kept getting interrupted with, what could happen when you went on a train. And there were a lot of choices like that I just felt this context could have been provided earlier so that when the scene itself happened, there wouldn't have been any interruption to the flow of events or emotion. So on Goodreads, I gave this a rating of 2 out of 5 just because the writing style really didn't work for me. In terms of the choice of this as a recommendation, so when I was given the recommendation letter, the service said the reason they'd recommended this to me was because I liked the mythological retellings of Madeline Miller, so Circe and Song of Achilles were 2 of my all-time favourites. And this is another case where they've made an assumption about why I like something and then recommended other things based on that assumption, when the truth is that I don't have anything against fairy tale retellings or mythological retellings, but that wasn't the reason why I loved those books. I loved those books because the worlds were so rich and the writing was so vivid and the character relationships and the dynamics between different characters were so fascinating. In Circe, it was so much of her relationship with her siblings and always being the one who wasn't quite a god, wasn't quite as good as the rest of them, and how even after she's exiled and later comes into contact with them again, how much of that bitterness and resentment still lies underneath everything, and how much betrayal there is when she has this one brother who she thought she was really close to and she finds that he didn't feel the same way about her. So it's all of that, it's the relationships and the emotion that I liked about it, not that it was a mythological retelling. The same thing with the Song of Achilles. I loved the world and the rhythm of the language and the relationship as it built up between Achilles and Patroclus? I am probably butchering that. I cannot remember his name. I'm very sorry, especially because the book meant so much to me. But the build-up of their relationship and how there's this yearning on both sides and how that builds and builds, and then the devastation at the end. And this is why I liked it, not because it was a mythological retelling. And I wish if they were recommending something to me based on me liking those books, they'd recommended something that had similar relationships or characters or writing style, as opposed to, here's a mythological retelling, here's another mythological retelling. Surely someone will like both of those. So in terms of recommendations, I felt it was very much like the reasoning behind Dare Me, in that they decided to recommend it based on another book that I said I'd liked, even though it wasn't very similar to the book I'd said I'd liked, other than in a superficial way. So from here, in the TBR website, there's actually a section where you can give feedback on your recommendations. So I'm going to give feedback on each of the 3 books they recommended to me, whether I thought they were a good recommendation and why or why not. You can also give them a star rating there. So I think in the TBR website, I'm going to be a little bit more aggressive with my star ratings than I was on Goodreads, just because I want it to be really clear to them whether or not I liked something. So on Goodreads, I gave Gods of Jade and Shadow 2 stars because I don't think it's a terrible book. I just think it was meant for a different audience. I think it should have been marketed as a middle grade book, or it should have been written in a different way if it's reaching a young adult or adult audience. So 2 stars for that. In TBR, I think I'm going to give it 1 star because I want them to be sure that they never recommend anything that's written in that type of style to me ever again. Similarly, the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, I gave that a 3 star on Goodreads just because even though it was a really good recommendation for me, I was frustrated with some of how it was executed. In TBR, I'm going to give that 4 stars because it was a good recommendation and I still would recommend that book to someone like me, even though there was this one thread of the plot that I didn't really like. When it comes to the service as a whole, I still think there's merit in having a service like this, especially if, like me, you've been in a reading slump and you're really struggling to find new, interesting things to read. This basically takes the pressure off you, and you know that every 3 months you're going to get a recommendation for 3 books that you may not have found on your own. I think the recommendations themselves could be better, but having said that, I probably could have done more to ensure that they were better recommendations. If I was looking for something specific, I could have outlined that in my intake questionnaire or in my profile, and I'm hoping that when I give my feedback on each of these books, that contributes to much better recommendations next time. So for me, I'm going to keep my subscription open for at least 1 more quarter just because I do want to see what the next 3 recommendations are once they've got my feedback for these 3 books and once I update my profile a little bit more. I don't know if I'll keep it open beyond that. I think it depends on what the next 3 recommendations are, but I do still have a lot of hope for this service. And at $15, luckily I'm in the position where that is easily manageable and definitely manageable for the next quarter. So that is all from me. Now I would love to hear from you. Have you ever used TBR or tailored book recommendations? And if so, what was your experience? Did you get really good recommendations that were a fit for what you like and what you were looking for? Or did you feel like they missed the mark a little bit like I did? Or if you haven't used this service, tell me about how you find the next books you're going to read, because as you've probably noticed, I have struggled a little bit this year, so I would love to have some more channels for finding really good reads. If you like this video, please give me a big thumbs up, and I will see you next time. Bye.